I'm Cédric Van Meerbeeck. I'm the climatologist with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. We are located in Barbados, but we serve 16 Caribbean countries. Right now, we are here in the function of the Caribbean Regional Climate Center, who works with our national Met services from across the geographies of the Caribbean to actually come with forecasts, not of what the weather will be like in the next few days, but what the next season will look like. In terms of, we know in the Caribbean that we're entering into a drier season, but how will it look like this year, and will it look any different than it usually does? But before we set the stage as to how the next season will look like, we need to look back a little bit to kind of take stock of where we are right now, because knowing where we are right now might influence how we need to make our decisions going forward. So we are at the global level experiencing something called in meteorology a La Niña event. A La Niña event is when the surface temperatures or the ocean temperatures in the Pacific are cooler than usual. Why am I saying the Pacific? That's far away from the Caribbean. Well, the reason is that when there's a La Niña tends to influence our weather patterns at the seasonal time scale here. What happens here during a La Niña? Well, across the Caribbean, typically La Niña is when you get wetter years. That's one thing. When you also get a stronger end part of your hurricane season. So from September until October, we had a lot of systems passing through the region. La Niña is one of the main reasons for that. The next thing that happens is, fortunately for us, heat was not as tremendously a problem this year as it's been, for instance, in 2020, when the opposite pattern occurred. Okay, so that's a start. Now, how did that affect our climate other than that in terms of hazards? Well, you might have heard on the news, as recently as a couple of weeks ago, St. Lucia and other countries, Dominica, etc., had some really bad flash floods that tore through parts of the countries. And that they were not the only ones. If you look back since May until now, until recently, you've really had a whole string of countries across the Caribbean that experienced flooding at some time, with unfortunately damages and losses to our agriculture and to other sections of our economy. So that's the starting point. We are not experiencing any major drought across any parts of the Caribbean. That's a positive. But on the other hand, we're getting out of the wet season with soils that in many places are quite drenched. So that means that if in the next weeks we get a lot of rainfall, even though we're entering the dry season, we might still see flash floods wherever that extreme rainfall occurs. And the highest risk for that to occur is in the Guianas and in the southern parts of the island, so in the ABC Islands of Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, in Trinidad and Tobago, in Grenada, in Barbados, and then less so as you go further north. If you go as far north as the Bahamas, actually, remember I said we are in a La Niña event. A La Niña will tend to give us drier weather more often in the northwest of the region, so in the Bahamas, in Cuba, in Cayman Islands, and sometimes also in Belize. If that is the case, they are the ones who now have to look into their dry season if drought will develop. Because if that's the case, you know that it's the dry season, which is from now until May, also largely overlaps with our main season, touristically speaking. And of course, if we have more people in the region, tourists alike or locals, if the total amount of people in the region is increased, well, the water consumption increases as well. So in those areas where it might actually end up be drier than usual in the dry season, which as the name implies, when you get less rain, you might actually see that the water reservoirs might lower a little bit faster than usual. In our neck of the woods, which is in the southeastern Caribbean, it's the opposite. We are going to see, fortunately, normal, if our forecasts are right, we're going to see our water reservoirs deplete slower than usual. So the good news is we are not so much water stressed this time around, but we still need to pay attention to flooding, because even though we're entering the dry season, that might still play a role.
So you spoke to tourism. Can you elaborate a little bit on some of the other sectors, like for instance agriculture, which is very important in the southeastern Caribbean?
Correct. So agriculture has, for the longest time in the Caribbean and still today, mostly depend on rainfall as their water source, water resource. There are countries, of course, where water is also produced out of salt water, which is called desalination. But wherever water is mainly coming from rainfall, whether through rivers or whatnot, we always ask ourselves the questions going into the dry season: are we in the agriculture sector going to have enough rainfall to plant this crop or that crop? Which one should I favor? And fortunately, the amount of rains should not be as stressful as, for instance, in 2014, 15, 16, when we had the opposite to a La Niña event, which is called El Niño, which leads to drought in the region. That notwithstanding, though I am talking about region-wide patterns, at any given location, you might experience more rainfall or less rainfall than a neighboring location. So what we are talking about is regional trends, and that's important to bear in mind, because even though your country at large, if you're a large country, or your island versus the neighboring island might have totally different weather patterns within the season, with one ending a bit drier than usual, the other one being much wetter. That means that there might be a bit of drought here, but there might be more flooding there. So we need to prepare for flooding. We need to prepare for the chance of having locally drier conditions, which might impact agriculture. But I think the bigger risk for agriculture, especially in the southeastern Caribbean, is going to be crop damage because of flooding.
You were speaking about the Christmas season. People have a tendency not to pay attention to the weather, but that is important. And you had a reference what happened in St. Vincent and St. Lucia in 2013.
Yes. So if we think back about 9 years ago, if you are from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, or if you're from St. Lucia, what you will remember is Christmas floods. Now, Christmas is traditionally a period where we like to think joyous things. We might not always pay as much attention to the weather as we normally would during the hurricane season, for instance. Well, keep in mind that this year flooding is a bigger risk in December than in other years. So I'm not saying it's going to flood in your area, but what I'm saying is keep checking the weather reports in your country to make sure that it doesn't happen to you without you knowing about it. So keep informed.
You spoke earlier about if you are correct, and I know in your field you like to talk about confidence and probability. So can you elaborate and tell us what the concept means and how confident you are that the outlook is correct?
So when we talk about forecasts, whether it's on the weather timescales, which is a couple of hours to a couple of days, or what we call the climate timescale, which is going from weeks to centuries, it doesn't matter. We as scientists have a role, a critical role, to be honest about how certain we are about what we say, or sometimes when we know that we're missing something that cannot be forecasted, for instance. And so it is important that as forecasters we learn to communicate how confident we are and why we are confident about the information that we give. Yes, it's true, sometimes we can't even tell if it's gonna rain in your backyard 2 days from now. But there are different things that can matter in terms of causing the rainfall to be more intense in a season than in a certain day. On a seasonal time scale, so that means a couple of months, what we get as an advantage is that the amount of heat that is in our oceans will largely drive whether you're going to get more of those wet days or fewer of those wet days. So knowing about how the state is in the ocean can give us more confidence in terms of predicting how much rainfall we're going to get, how many storms we're going to see, if heat is going to be a problem, if drought is going to be a problem, etc. So that's something that we always track, but honestly, if I'm speaking as a person who consumes the information, not just one who produces it, sometimes I'm wondering, are we speaking the right language when we speak about confidence? What you can know as our audience is that when we are confident and we state it so, it does not mean 100% sure something will happen, but that it's much more likely to happen than not to happen. So especially when we're confident about a way that weather and climate is going to impact you, take note of that, don't bet on it, but take note of that and prepare for it.
Thanks a lot, Cedric.